acknowledge that Avis reservations are located on the ancestral lands of the Pennacook, Pawtucket, and other indigenous people, which was their home for more than 10,000 years. We honor the land we manage and all the indigenous people who were before, are here now, and will be here in the future. We recognize that we are guests on this land and are mindful of our impact. With this acknowledgement, we commit to continuously care for this land using sustainable practices to protect the environment and provide stewardship for the ecology and habitat of Avis reservations. Welcome to everyone. I'm John Hess, president of Avis. Some of you are on Zoom, I know, quite a large number. Thank you for joining us, and others are at Oak and Iron. Please save me a beer for later. I'd like to thank Oak and Iron for allowing us to have our in-person session there. You may remember that a couple of years ago, actually now 3 years ago, Oak and Iron created a beer to honor the Avis 125th anniversary. Well, they tell me that they're going to reissue that beer within the next few weeks, so please do go by and buy some Journey's End. Speaking of the 125th anniversary, Avis also had that year a challenge hike. Many people, I think over 80, and one dog completed that hike, and the 25 hikes, and were able to get a t-shirt at the end. Well, the town of Andover is now celebrating its 375th anniversary, and there's a challenge to do 20 hikes in Andover by the end of May. Anyway, I was mentioning that the town of Andover's 375th anniversary is this year, and through May of this year, you can do the challenge hike. Go to either the Avis website or the Town Conservation Commission, and you can get the list of trails that need to be done. And then you turn that in, and at the end, you'll get a backpack. So enjoy hiking 20 trails in Andover. Also, the Andover is going through right now a process of studying the Shawshene River. So you might want to check out the website on the town to look at what's happening with the town study of the Shawshene River and provide your input. There's going to be quite a bit going on. Come up with a master plan for the Shawshene River. So tonight we're going to go over a number of different business items. We have to elect trustees for a 3-year term. We're going to be hearing from Ryan Wheeler, who's at the Peabody Institute at Phillips Academy, talking about indigenous populations. But we have a lot of things to be proud of over the last year, a couple of years now. The pandemic, the increase in usage of Avis reservations has been great. But we have a lot of volunteers. We have rangers, we have wardens, we have a lot of people who are taking care of the trails, making sure that everything is open. Please thank any of these volunteers when you see them out there working on the trails. And thank you for using our trails. And thank you for being respectful of nature, and hope that we can keep up the good work in Andover. Some of you may recognize the scene behind me. I'm not going to tell you where it is, but in a later time during the evening, I will certainly give you the answer. It's a little quiz. You can recognize this. You'll get a star on your forehead or something, but it's a nice scene in an Avis reservation. Please keep your microphones on mute so that you won't disrupt the rest of the meeting. But at the end, there will be an opportunity once Dr. Wheeler gives his presentation. There will be an opportunity through the chat for you to ask questions. So be aware of that. If you're not aware of chat and Zoom, look at the bottom of your screen, and there is a chat box, and that's where you'll be able to put in your questions for Dr. Wheeler. Finally, at Oak and Iron, they can't hear me. But if you're not at Oak and Iron, you wouldn't care. But we do have some leftover items vests, T-shirts, and trails guides. If you want to buy them, you don't have them, please do contact me. Then I guess if you're on Zoom, you can contact me, and we'll try and get you some of the items that we sold during the pandemic and during the 125th anniversary. So now we're going to go to, enough of me talking, I'm going to go to a video that was done by Andover TV, John Murphy of Andover TV, at the encouragement of Al French. He taped a video of some open spaces in Andover. They really some pocket parks. The full video is available on the Avis website and the town website, but in any case, I'm going to give you a little bit of it now. So if we can go over to the video of Andover open spaces, please.
Move a little bit closer. That's perfect. Oh yeah, there you go.
There you go. Make it look like I like you.
A little bit of affection goes along.
Yeah, I know.
Jen and Tom Boshar love the outdoors.
I'm sorry.
In 2020,
That was stupid.
after spending a summer hiking trails near their summer cabin in Maine, Tom had an idea.
We were coming home in September, sometime late September, and I think I said, "Hey, let's hike all the Avis trails."
Yeah.
What you find out is, it's woods, it's trees, there's some water features, and they kind of, in a big picture, you say, they're all the same, but they're not. Each one is different. Each one is unique.
Andover's incredibly lucky to have so many different landowners who are focused on conserving land. So Avis is, I think, the second oldest land conservancy, land trust in the country.
Well, Avis was founded in 1894. This is the Indian Ridge Reservation, which was first purchased in 1897 to prevent a developer to buy this, take out all the gravel, and use it to pave Route 28.
So from its earliest years, Andover had a group that was hyper-focused on setting aside properties to allow the citizens to get out and enjoy nature. In addition to that, we have a Harold Parker State Forest. And then there's another group called the Trustees of Reservations, and we're lucky enough to have a property called the Ward Reservation around the corner, which is owned and maintained by the trustees.
In addition, the town of Andover owns more than 2,000 acres of conservation property overseen by the Andover Conservation Commission.
It's a common confusion because as you walk around, it's not always evident that you're on, now I'm on town property, now I'm on Avis property, oh wait, the state forest is starting here. But in the end, it's all positive because they're all very well-maintained properties.
So yes, we do have a lot of open space in Andover. Some say as much as 30% of the town is in conservation or otherwise protected. So I hope everybody's been enjoying them. And particularly since the weather seems to be warming up, I'm sure you'll be getting out there. Thank you for doing that video, Andover TV. So let me get our first business item out of the way. I'm going to introduce now Larry Ardito, who's our treasurer, and he will provide a short report on the financial status of Avis. Go ahead, Larry.
Good evening. My name is Larry Ardito, and I'm the current treasurer of Avis, the Andover Village Improvement Society, the second oldest land trust in Massachusetts. I am the treasurer, as I mentioned, and I am pleased to report that in 2021 has been a very, very good year. I know that sounds like Frank Sinatra. Our revenues were $206,000, and we spent the following. On land management, we spent $15,000, land stewardship, $10,000, administration, which includes insurance, accounting, and all sorts of other expenses, postage, fundraising, $48,000, And we invested last year in capital projects, $17,000, which I'm sure that people that are after me will tell you about, for a total of $90,000. We, in our operating account presently, as of December 31st, 2021, we have $86,000. Our investment accounts are currently with Fidelity Investments. The Finance Committee has met numerous times during the year and has allocated the funds, trying to recognize the need for growth as well as mitigate the risk. We are currently allocated at approximately somewhere in the vicinity of 55 stocks, 45 bonds. We take this responsibility very seriously. The following are the balances of the Fidelity accounts as of December 31st, 2021. Land stewardship has 214,000. Land acquisition has 445,000. Unrestricted has almost $300,000. And a relatively new account, the John Ragg account, currently has 74, and we're expecting another contribution from the estate of John Ragg. Currently, the amount is $1,032,000 in all of the Fidelity accounts. I am also pleased to report that going forward into 2022, Avis is in a very, very strong position. And I thank you for your attention, and respectfully submitted, Lawrence Ardito. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Larry, for that report. Certainly, Avis is in a strong position thanks to our members and other donors who are supporting us over time. And we're always constantly looking for new projects, new land to purchase, or starting to spend more money on taking care of the land that we currently own. So thank you all for your support. I'd like to now introduce a different drone video. A different video. It's taken by a drone. The drone was operated by our friend Alan Michael, and he's done a number of our drone videos, and they show on the Avis website. If you're interested, you can go there and look at them. The first ones he took were in the summertime, and so everything's green. But last fall, we went out and he did another drone video of fall colors. I think you'll be interested to see the colors that shine brightly from above. So it's a little bit different view. The video was edited by Kate Kalatis, a college student who used to be at Andover High. And she did a very good job of editing this particular drone video and doing some voiceover. So let me now introduce you to the Shawsheen River Reservation from the sky.
The Shawsheen River Reservation is parallel between the river and the MBTA railroad tracks. In the fall, there is spectacular panoply of color, particularly along the banks of the river. A visitor can park on Abbott Bridge Drive and enter the Shawsheen River Reservation from the north off of Central Street. From the south, visitors can enter the reservation through the Vale Reservation. Visitors can enjoy views of the river, including the famous octopus tree. The Shawsheen River Reservation is a popular picnic spot. Avis is a nonprofit land trust dedicated to acquiring open space in Andover, Massachusetts, and conserving it into perpetuity. Avis manages its reservations to protect native habitat and provide opportunities for the public to experience, enjoy, and learn about nature through passive recreation.
Well, yes, very colorful. I was amazed when I first saw it how much the color was focused around the river. Sure, somebody can explain that to us if we know some scientific person who knows why the trees around the river change color first. But I just thought that was very striking. Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Alan, for doing that. Now I'd like to introduce our land management report. Most of you probably know Dave Dargy and Buzz Stepchinsky. We owe a great thanks to them for their leadership, as well as I said earlier, to rangers and to weed warriors and to wardens. But let me introduce David Dargy, land manager, and Buzz Stepchinsky, our Avis trustee in charge of land management. They'll give an overview of the activities over the past year.
Hi, I'm Buzz Stepchinsky. I'm chairman of the Avis Land Management Committee, and I'd like to talk to you for a couple of minutes tonight about some of the things that we did this past year. In November, we had a virtual training session with the wardens. We had about 55 to 60 people involved with that. We had not only the wardens, but the weed warriors attended, and a number of our members spoke about projects that they've been working on this past year. We also had the Andover tree warden, Paul Sanborn, speak about problems that he's seeing with street trees. We had botanist Walter Kittredge speak about the work going on in the Lupine Reservation. And then we had a bit of a training session with Gabe Siegel with Parterre Associates. And he talked about some of the issues with regarding invasive species that we're seeing in Andover. So I want to thank everybody that attended for a virtual session. We thought it was pretty successful. And then I want to report on the Boy Scout Eagle projects. Every year we have a number of scouts take part in projects. Typically they do boardwalks for us to improve our trails. So this past year we had about 500 feet of boardwalks built. We had Nick Stolt from Troop 77 do a boardwalk in the Rafton Reservation. And in the Bon Air Reservation, we had two boys. We had Nick McNally from Troop 75 and Jack Stedman from Troop 79. They partnered on a boardwalk in the Bon Air Reservation. Ryan Greenwood built a boardwalk at the very beginning of the Collins Reservation. And then we ended the year with Miles Frazier from Troop 79. He built a boardwalk in the Smith Reservation. So I want to thank all the Boy Scouts and their troop leaders and their advisors and their parents for all the help that they provided them and the advantage that they gave us to make our trails safe and passable throughout the whole year. So again, I want to thank all the boys and everything they've done.
Hello, Avis friends. I'd like to start by pointing out the surprising benefits to Avis volunteers. You will have a brighter outlook on life when you meet trail walkers and assist them by giving directions. You will improve your overall mental health by helping others and answering questions about the reservation. You will do something rewarding with your spare time. You didn't know how rewarding it is to drag down trees off the trail in the middle of a rainstorm. You will develop new skills learning how to cut brush while walking on steep, icy trails. You will explore your interests. In the past, you didn't realize how much you enjoyed being out in the woods, and now your family is wondering where you are all the time. What do Avis Land Management Committee volunteers do in either rain or shine, the heat of the summer and the snow and ice of the winter? They clip limbs and brush that is growing into the trail with limb loppers. They cut broken branches and down trees and drag them off the trail. They mow meadow trails and trails with huge amounts of brush. They install boardwalks. They repair broken boards on our boardwalks. They pick up trash along our road frontage and river frontage. They install signs. They relocate trails. They cut and fill steep side slopes on trails. They repair trail erosion, and they meet and greet our visitors. There are 71, yes, 71 people that volunteer as land management committee members, rangers, and wardens. These are people who care for our environment, that volunteer their time on a regular basis. Avis's success is a direct result of volunteers. Avis appreciates your work. The inhabitants of Andover appreciate your work, and our visitors from afar appreciate your work. Oh, and one last surprising benefit to being an Avis volunteer is that you will become more social, at least at the Oak and Iron.
Well, there are more than one ways to be social, but being social in the trails is certainly a good part of it. Well, thank you, Buzz and David, for that report. Before I go on, I'd like to say to those on Zoom, you might not realize it now. I do hear that Oak and Iron does have full sound, so that's good. Thank you all for joining us down there. And please turn around and thank the Oak and Iron staff for allowing us to be there today. One of the things I mentioned at the beginning, which the Oak and Iron people maybe didn't hear, was that I'm going to have a little quiz, see if anybody recognizes the place behind me. It is an Avis reservation, and in a few minutes I'll let you know where it is, but everybody can be talking about it among yourselves if you want. You can guess where this is. But before we go on, I'd like to show another video. Alan Michael and Kate Coladas also did a video of the Goldsmith Woodlands. Well, actually, access from the Goldsmith Woodlands for the most of the public goes to Foster's Pond. So now I'd like to show a quick video, again, from the sky of the colors in Foster's Pond.
Foster's Pond is managed by the Foster's Pond Corporation. A major portion of its banks are owned by Avis. In the fall, the trees around the pond really show why New England is so well known for its colors. Primary access for the public is through Avis's Goldsmith Woodlands off of South Main Street. A popular hike is to Bessie's Point, named for Andover's native and former owner Bessie Goldsmith. Many views of the pond are possible from this location. Visitors can really enjoy the spectacular colors of the fall. Founded in 1894 as the Andover Village Improvement Society, Avis is one of the oldest land conservation organizations in the country. Avis manages more than 30 reservations, comprising more than 1,200 acres in the town of Andover. It relies on a core of volunteers to lead the organization and provide maintenance of its recreational trails and stewardship for the land and its wildlife habitat. Donations from community members and grant sources provide the funds to acquire, protect, and manage its reservations.
But as you heard, I'm sitting right now on the bench at Bessie's Point. So thank you again, Kate and Alan, for that beautiful video from above of Foster's Pond. I think there's several people on this Zoom today, or maybe down at Oak and Iron, who live near there, and I hope everybody's had a chance to go down in the fall and see the bright colors, but really there are just so many colors in New England. Now I'd like to welcome Amy Janowski, chair of our Land Stewardship Committee, and her team for an update on what we now are calling the Weed Warriors. They spent a lot of activity particularly over the past year, to try and control the invasive species, but they're just everywhere. So it's a long way to go, but we've made a start thanks to this group. So Amy, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Janowski, and I chair the Land Stewardship Committee for Avis. And land stewardship is kind of a new way of managing our properties, in addition to all the great work that the wardens and David Dargy have been doing for years to design good trails to keep track of erosion, make sure the trees are not blocking access, all of that type of thing. In addition, we're starting to realize that with climate change and changes in our local weather conditions, invasive plants are impacting our properties more and more each year. And so land stewardship tries to take a slightly different approach and say, what plants ideally should be here on this forest property or on this meadow property or near a river front, and what plants are actually here, which plants are missing, and what can we do to tip the balance back toward a good, healthy environment for the birds, the critters, the amphibians that should be present to live in happily. So part of what I do is I tend to write grant proposals and look for funding. And currently we're kind of hopeful, but not quite certain whether we'll have some more funding from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They gave us a 3-year grant to work on the Shawshene River Reservation, and that work made a huge difference there. We're hoping to do some similar work out at Deer Jump, which is a very important flyway for migratory birds and including bald eagles for that matter. I saw one last week. And the invasive plants are beginning to disrupt the continuity of that 5-mile property along the Merrimack River. So volunteers are crucial. They're a really important part of everything we do at Avis. We're an all-volunteer land trust. And we also have some great advisors. I'd like to give a quick shout out to Walter Kittredge, who is a botanist with 37 years of experience. And he's been fantastic in helping us set priorities, understand the ecosystems we're working with. And basically, at this moment, he's now helping because he has started a native plant nursery. And that gives us a local resource to begin to add plants back into the landscape. And again, he's able to offer scientific guidance on that. So that's terrific. I would like to introduce Denise Boucher. She's the volunteer coordinator and a fellow trustee. Denise.
Hi, everyone. It's my job to organize all the volunteers for Avis. And we have so much work, as Amy has said, to be done out there. And thanks to you, we have so many volunteers that are interested in constantly contacting me through the website, looking for things that they can do. So basically our task has been trying to keep that engine running, keep everybody that's interested in volunteering really busy. And last year we had a great year because we were very organized about trying to schedule work parties ongoing at one reservation. We did go to a couple others, but we did focus most of our efforts on Lupine Reservation. And it really got an opportunity for a lot of people to get involved, to consistently work in one space and see the efforts, see the outcome of their efforts. And it was just very rewarding. So we're hoping to do more of that. And over the course of that season, we've had more and more people step up. It's been really exciting. We've had people with many, many different backgrounds. We've had such a diverse group, all ages and abilities, and many, many talents. So we've all learned so much from each other as we've been out there. So I'm hoping that more people are going to get involved. This season, we now have a new person who stepped up to lead the Weed Warriors. That's the name of our group that we have that works on these reservations to remove invasive plants. if you're interested in volunteering, the best way is to tap into the Weed Warriors. Contact me through the website under volunteers and write in there what you're interested in doing. If you mention the Weed Warriors, you'll get a schedule sent to you of our activities, the work parties that we're going to be doing all season. We had our first one last week, and they're going to run all summer long, and you can contact us and possibly attend one of those. You may end up rolling up your sleeves, or pulling out some invasive plants, or planting, or just identifying things. Whatever skills and abilities you want to bring to us, we're very thankful for it. So I will introduce you to Lynn, who is our head for the Weed Warriors.
Well, thank you, Denise and Amy. So I am Lynn Landry, and I'm very excited about leading the Weed Warriors this year. I had the pleasure of working with a ecological restoration specialist for the last couple of years, volunteering, and it has been fantastic. And I'm really glad that I can share what I've learned with all of you, and get everybody out in the field and enjoying the Avis properties in so many more ways. So we had our first, as Denise said, we had our first session last weekend, and a new volunteer sent me an email right after that said, I had no idea that I was going to have so much fun, and I want to do it again. So I mean, I think that says it all. So, we're doing a good thing. We're removing invasives. We're planting native plants. We're outdoors, and we're having fun. So, I mean, it's a win-win all around. So, email Denise at volunteer@avisandover.org. And if you can put, Weed Warrior or something in the subject line, that'll help. And hope to see you this season. Thank you.
It'll be great.
Thanks, everybody. Look forward to seeing you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Amy and Denise and Lynn. Obviously, a lot of good work going on there. If you're interested in invasive species, you may want to check out another volunteer's work. Amber Ferris has put together a blog for Avis, and it talks primarily about invasive species. So you can check that out on our website if you'd like. Now, I'd like to introduce Jim Sutton, who's the Avis Vice President. But more importantly, he helped us last year. The trustees decided to undertake a strategic planning process. It hadn't been done for several years, and we thought it would be important. And so we did a strategic planning process to kind of help us go forward. So I'm going to introduce now Jim Sutton, who will tell us about that a little bit.
First of all, I want to thank you, the members, for responding so heartily to our request to renew your membership. I particularly want to thank those of you who joined this past year. We had a phenomenal response to the town-wide mailing with more than 270 new members. Avis needs new members and volunteers to continue the energy that has carried it through its first 127 years. Thank you for joining. Throughout the first 6 months of 2021, the Avis Board of Trustees carried out a strategic planning process. Why does Avis need a strategic plan? Avis has been and is basically an all-volunteer organization, with the exception of one part-time land manager who has overseen the management of our reservations and provided leadership for our volunteer wardens. With invasive species ever encroaching, as well as the other impacts of climate change, we have been challenged more than ever to steward our properties. Animal habitat and native plant varieties on many of our reservations have been threatened by invasive plant life that grows unchecked by natural causes. Also, Avis now owns most of the land that borders the Merrimack River and the Andover and much of the Shawshene River. As well as responding to vegetative changes caused by changing climate, we need to fight erosion along our riverbanks and keep our riparian areas free of trash. The strategic planning effort was driven by the recognition that we needed to set goals and objectives to help us meet these challenges. To assist us, we engaged the services of Rob Johnson, who is the executive director of the Massachusetts Land Trust Alliance. He helped us interview various stakeholders as well as our board members to find out what they thought our major challenges were. The trustees did some further preliminary work sorting through the data, and then we met last June in a church basement on what was the hottest night of the summer to prioritize our goals and objectives. A summary of the plan was contained in the recent Avis update. As you look through this year's goals, you will find that Avis remains a volunteer organization and that the goals are mainly intended to help increase the effectiveness of our volunteers, including our board. As part of the process, the trustees worked with our facilitator on a slight rewording of the mission statement, which I will now end this segment of the meeting by reading. Avis is a nonprofit land trust dedicated to acquiring open space in Andover, Massachusetts, and conserving it into perpetuity. Avis manages its reservations to protect native habitat and provide opportunities for the public to experience, enjoy, and learn about nature through passive recreation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. It was a very interesting process, and thanks to all the trustees for participating in it. And hopefully we are moving ahead in the direction that we should be going. I'd like to introduce one more video, if you don't mind. It's the another part of the video that for Andover Open Space that was inspired by Al French, and is, again, as I said, is on our website. Why don't we do that part of the video about Andover Open Space and pocket parks?
If you read that Article 97 of the state constitution, it's very simple. It says that the citizens of the Commonwealth have the right to breathe clean air, access to clean water, and open space just to unwind. I mean, it's very calm. I mean, don't you feel it? It's very calming.
I've been inspired by a quote from a poem by an English poet, but it turns out that the way he used it in the poem bears no relation to how I used it. But the quote, if I can remember the punchline, is still points in a turning world. And that's inspired me ever since I read it to say, like Vest Pocket Parks, they are still points. And they're in a turning world, which, as we all know, is happening, you know.
There are plenty of parks around Andover, either town or Avis properties, that we say everybody lives within 15-minute walk of a park. And they can get out and enjoy it either for a long hike or they can do a short one.
The world is crazy, right? We've all been through this craziness. So it's a way to get out and try to think about what's important in life. It's a way to find inner peace.
The absolute chaos and stress of life is, I think, growing and seems destined to continue to grow. And being able to get out away from it all and spend some time looking at a stream rolling by at your feet, or I don't know, there's just something about clearing your head and letting nature sort of seep back into your body, even for 20 minutes on a daily basis.
It's what Mary really loved, the idea of a place where you can come and obtain emotional help for feeling at peace with the world.
So, whether you prefer smaller parks or larger ones, whether it's a traditional trail or a vest pocket park, no matter how you define it, when it comes to open spaces, Andover's got you covered. For Andover TV, I'm Sean Murphy.
Well, thank you, Sean, and everybody who participated in that video. That wasn't the full video, it was only parts of it. As I mentioned before, all these videos are available on the Avis website. In fact, I should put a plug in here for the Andover Chroniclers, who work out of the at the Robb Center, the senior center in town, and then they are doing another video about Andover parks. So please watch for that to be released sometime in the near future. Now, before we get to the keynote speaker, I'd like to be able to move on to the election of trustees, the last item of business. There are, every year we elect 5 trustees for 3-year terms. And tonight we have over 100 people participating in our event tonight. So thank you all for coming. I don't know if everyone is a member. Technically, only members are allowed to vote. But because of the kind of technology we're using tonight, I think it's best if we just instruct our secretary, Kay Frischman, to cast one vote for the slate. So in a minute, I'll show you the slate. If anybody wants to object to this type of voting, please let me know. But we did this last year as well. So why don't we show the slate of voters, a slate of candidates, and 15 members of the trustees. 5 are being renewed. Thank you for renewing. And so now that you can see who they are, I will ask that our secretary please cast one vote to be shown in the minutes as having voted for the slate of 5 people to renew their terms for the 2022-2025 season. Okay. We can move on now. Oh, there's. Thank you, Kay. Thank you, Kay, for moving that ahead. And thank you for also chairing the nominating committee. Now, what everybody has been waiting for is our keynote speaker. I'd like to introduce Ryan Wheeler. It's my great pleasure to do so. He's the director of the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology at Phillips Academy. He's written books and done other lectures on this and other and related topics. His talk today will provide you with information about the indigenous peoples of Andover. And as I said at the beginning, if you have questions, you'll be able to put them in the chat after Dr. Wheeler's speech. And he's available on the Zoom tonight to answer questions. People at Oak and Iron, please find Jim Sutton. Jim, raise your hand and wave it around or something so he can, Jim will put your questions into the chat for you if you have any at that point. So, okay, thank you very much. And let's move now to Dr. Wheeler's video.
Good evening. My name is Ryan Wheeler, and I'm the director of the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology here at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. I'd like to begin my talk tonight about Indigenous Andover by situating myself as a white man, descendant of fairly recent immigrants from Europe. I'd like to note, too, that while I'll be sharing some of Andover's Indigenous history, I'm not speaking for Indigenous people. I hope that my talk does inspire everyone to learn a little bit more about Indigenous history here in Andover, in Massachusetts, and in the United States. I'm going to begin by sharing the Indigenous land acknowledgement that Phillips Academy recently adopted. We're on native land. We acknowledge Phillips Academy's presence on land once inhabited by the Pennacook and Pawtucket peoples, as well as the modern-day Abenaki, Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Wabanaki, Pokanoket, and Nipmuc nations. Phillips Academy honors all Indigenous peoples who are here now, have been here for time immemorial, and will be here in the future. I was on the committee that promulgated the land acknowledgement, and it's worth noting that the efforts were led by Indigenous students at Phillips Academy. Their longer version of the land acknowledgement included more about what happened to Indigenous people in our area, including loss of life, dispossession of lands, and repression of religion and spirituality, as well as a call to action to learn more about this history and to work toward reconciliation and healing. So this talk delves into some of that history, and I hope inspires everyone to learn more and look for ways to engage and take action. Tonight, I'll talk about four things: archaeological evidence, the story of Kachamakan and his sale of Andover to the English, Nancy Parker, and modern Indigenous people. I want to talk briefly about archaeological evidence for Indigenous people in Andover, since this establishes not only native land tenure, but also gives us a sense of time depth. During World War II, gas rationing restricted archaeologists at the Peabody Institute from extensive travels to conduct surveys and excavations, so they worked locally. Archaeologist Ripley Bullen led efforts to locate and test sites in the Shawsheen River drainage, ultimately documenting over 100 sites with artifacts ranging from thousands of years ago well into the time of European contact and conquest. Not long after Bullen's survey, avocational archaeologists found one of the oldest sites in New England, the Bullbrook site in Ipswich. Around 12,000 years ago, not long after the retreat of the glaciers, Indigenous hunters tracked and hunted caribou. Fluted points like those from the Bullbrook site have also been found at sites in Andover. Using both archaeological and ethnographic data, archaeologists Douglas Byers and Fred Johnson worked with model maker Theodore Pittman to create the iconic diorama depicting Andover 500 years ago. Today, we recognize a variety of pedagogical issues with murals and dioramas, but in the 1940s, Pittman's model endeavored to show many details of Indigenous life on the eve of European intrusion. I always ask students to look at the diorama and see if they can guess the time of year being depicted. No snow on the ground, so it's not winter. There is harvested corn, so maybe fall. There are smoked eels drying on racks, so possibly spring or early summer. What's interesting about the diorama is that Byers, Johnson, and Pittman conflate not only the seasons, but also geography, since Andover sits at the border between southern New England, where corn agriculture provided an economic base, and northern New England, the land of snowshoe hunters. So we have pretty quickly established a long tenure for Indigenous people on the landscape. The English arrive in the early 17th century and work to disrupt that tenure in a variety of ways. Even before the English arrive, the pressures brought by the French fur trade to the north have displaced Indigenous people and brought conflict and disease to what we now call Massachusetts. Epidemics beginning as early as 1616 may have wiped out close to 90% of the Indigenous population of the region. When the English arrive, it was not to a pristine natural and cultural paradise, but one that had already experienced considerable disruption. The English of the 17th century were not trained anthropologists, so coupled with the incredible disruption wrought by disease and desires to view Native people through a European lens, one has to treat the sparse written accounts of the time with a critical eye. So now let's talk about Kachamakan and the so-called sale of Andover, which happens early in the 1640s. The English were particularly interested in acquiring Indigenous lands through legal means, at least according to English law, though they weren't above using violence and the threat of violence. And this really sets the pattern for what follows in colonial times and then with the founding of the United States, the desire to take Indigenous land by any means. In many cases, indigenous people in New England signed deeds conveying large tracts of land to the English. With the sale of Andover, the agreement was more informal and ultimately memorialized in the records of the General Court when Cuchamakin made an appearance to affirm the sale. I'll read the testimony, which was recorded on May 16th, 1646. Cuchamakin, Sagamore of the Massachusetts, came into the court and acknowledged that for the sum of £6 and a coat, which he had already received, he had sold to Mr. John Woodbridge, on behalf of the inhabitants of Cochichewick, now called Andover, all his right, interest, and privilege in the land 6 miles southward from the town, 2 miles eastward to Rowley bounds, be the same more or less northward to Merrimack River, provided that the Indian called Roger and his company may have liberty to take alewives in Cochichewick River for their own eating. But if they either spoil or steal any corn or other fruit to any considerable value of the inhabitants there, this liberty of taking fish shall forever cease. And the said Roger is still to enjoy 4 acres of ground where now he plants. This purchase the court allows of, and having granted the said land to belong to the said plantation forever, to be ordered and disposed of by them, reserving liberty to the court to lay 2 miles square of their southerly bounds to any town or village that there may after be erected thereabouts, if so they see cause. That short passage, it's really just 2 or 3 sentences, contains a lot of information about the indigenous people of the area. Let's unpack some of it. The big question here is, who is Cuchamakin? And if he is a Sagamore leader of the Massachusetts, why is he selling Cochichewick, the land that becomes Andover, North Andover, and part of Lawrence? Some writers and researchers have fudged a little, recasting Cuchamakin as Pennacook, which is a native group typically associated with this area, or even suggested that he was sort of a con man, selling land he didn't own. Well, it's likely he's none of those things. He does appear in the colonial records frequently in this period. He's the brother of Chickatawbut, another prominent Massachusetts leader who becomes an ally then enemy of the English. Cuchamakin himself was no stranger to the English. His people, centered in Dorchester, were some of the first to hear John Eliot preach. They had many questions, but Eliot lacked the answers. So both sides went away dissatisfied. He also served as an interpreter and guide for the English, and seems to have taken a large role in the event that touched off the Pequot War in 1636. He even appeared in the General Court once asking about a coat, which apparently became part of his deal in the Andover sale. Before we explore Cuchamakin's connections to Andover, let's look at some of the other parts of the testimony. This past fall, I wanted to know more about the sale price, £6 sterling. By way of comparison, wages were fixed for many trades in the colonies due to a shortage of workers. In 1630, for example, carpenters and bricklayers could expect to earn about £26 per year. There are a number of online currency converters where you can enter a monetary figure and a year, and will tell you the value of that money today. Using Eric Nye's converter, £6 in 1646 is roughly $1,500 today. But hard currency was rare in the colonies, so that figure is probably more. For our purposes, let's stick with $1,500. Woodbridge bought about 63 square miles, or 40,564 acres. So Kachamakin received about 4 cents per acre. Today, an acre of land in Andover would cost somewhere around $250,000. If we calculate the rate of inflation, it's about 624 million. About half of Kachamakin's testimony to the general court concerns Roger and his company. We don't know very much about Roger, but we can infer that he and his people were indigenous folks that inhabited the area being sold to Woodbridge. The sale preserves both planting and fishing rights for Roger and includes an admonition against any untoward acts against the English crops. We don't see any further mention of Roger, so presumably he followed the rules. We also don't know where his 4-acre planting ground was located. This is really the fascinating part of Kachamakin's testimony because it acknowledges his familiarity with the area and the desire to preserve Roger's use. In fact, this goes to the very notion of usufruct rights, which was likely familiar to native people of New England and of less interest to the English. You have a right to use and enjoy the land, but you don't really own it. From one short piece of testimony, we can learn a lot about Indigenous Andover. Researchers like Kathleen Bragdon have already pointed out that what characterized native New England in this period were far-flung connections. For example, linkages between the Penacooks and Pawtuckets of the Merrimack drainage of what is now northeastern Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire show connections ranging as far south and east as Natick and Charlestown. Other historical evidence shows marriage ties between Penacooks and Pawtuckets with Nyantics and Wamasets as well. In fact, we know that Passaconaway, the notable Penacook leader headquartered in modern-day Lowell, used alliances, often through marriage, to significantly expand his dominion. We are likely seeing something like this playing out with Kachamakin and his connection to Cochichewick, the Andover area. These practices plagued English attempts to sort out land ownership and continue to run contrary to our concepts of indigenous political units and our desire for neatly bounded territories on a map. People moved over long distances using trails and watercourses, but not as itinerant vagabonds, but rather as users of resources and members of socio-political polities that ebbed and flowed as alliances came and went. I want to turn our attention now to Nancy Parker, another Andover resident, who is famous for a number of reasons. In historical accounts, Nancy Parker is typically described as the last Indian of Andover. Accounts often indicate mixed ancestry. She was born around 1752, was acknowledged as a champion spinner, and worked enslaved for farm families in the area as a laundress. Her marriage to Revolutionary War hero Salem Poor has helped enshrine Nancy in our national memory, though many details of her life are unknown to us. Most important, however, is her successful lawsuit that won her freedom and the freedom of her son Jonas. I'm grateful to archaeologist Ed Bell for his research on Nancy Parker and her freedom suit. Bell notes in his research that her impending marriage to Salem Poor is likely what inspired Nancy's lawsuit. In Massachusetts, children's legal status as free or enslaved was directly related to their mother's status. In order to win freedom for unborn children, Nancy needed to be free. The nonsensical part of Nancy's story is the trope of the last Indian. As Ed Bell notes, historical narratives often remember Nancy Parker as lonely and bewailing the loss of her tribe. Indigenous historian Gene O'Brien wrote a book about this phenomenon of firsting and lasting, which is a way of erasing Indigenous people from history. Think about how many local monuments or stories describe someone as the last of their tribe. In nearby Billerica, the story about Punjo, who is considered the last of the Wammaset. After his murder by colonists, he was buried by his kinfolk. Many of these stories contain their own contradictions, and yet they're really common. Whenever I talk about Indigenous people, I emphasize that they are still here. We've looked at two examples of historical persons, Kachamakan of the 17th century and Nancy Parker, who bridges the 18th and 19th centuries. But there are still Indigenous people now in the 21st century, and that is my most important message. According to the census, Essex County is home to over 7,000 Indigenous people. There are many ways to learn more about Indigenous people in Massachusetts today. Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard are home to the Mashpee and Aquinnah Wampanoag tribes, and there are a number of other Indigenous communities in the state, including Wampanoag bands and the Nipmuc. In neighboring New Hampshire and Maine, there are vibrant communities of Abenaki and Wabanaki. There are also a number of organizations engaged in public education and activism, including the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness, the North American Indian Center of Boston, and the United Native Americans of New England. Check out their websites and social media for talks, events, and more. Some of the tribes and groups that I've just mentioned are advocating for both social and legislative changes, and their websites have information on how you can support those causes. For example, the United Native Americans of New England have been active in eliminating Native imagery from school mascots. Finally, I'd like to mention Christoph Strobel's 2020 book, Native Americans of New England, which does an excellent job of telling both historical and contemporary perspectives. Many thanks to Avis for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm happy to field any questions after the meeting, or if you'd like to contact me at the Peabody Institute at Phillips Academy. Thank you and good evening.
Well, very nice. Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate your doing that. No, I'd like to be able to let people ask questions. As I said before, if you're at Oak and Iron and have a question, please find Jim Sutton and he'll type it into his laptop. But if anybody is on the Zoom and wants to ask a question, please go ahead and type a chat, and Jude Livermore will read those questions so that Ryan can answer them. Any questions out there? No, I don't. Anything coming in? It was very interesting, and
Yeah, I don't see anything. I don't see anything. Feel free to message.
I see one question that came to me in the chat from Richard Davis, who's actually one of our volunteers at the Peabody, an adult volunteer. And he asked if let's see, what did he ask exactly? He says, does the Peabody still have any of the artifacts uncovered in the 1940s? That's a great question. And yes, in fact, I think we have all of them. And what's interesting is some of the most interesting artifacts that were uncovered. Certainly, there are a lot of indigenous artifacts, but one of the discoveries made during that project was the homestead of Lucy Foster, who was a freed Black woman who lived in Andover, really probably most of her life, and it was, in fact, the excavation of her home was the first time anybody had done any archaeology of an African-American site. And some of her artifacts including a pair of her glasses, have been loaned to the Smithsonian African American Museum of History and Culture. And so if you visit that museum in Washington, you can actually see a great exhibit about Lucy Foster and her story, and some of the objects from our collection. So it's always exciting when we get to loan things to the Smithsonian.
Oh, I see some other questions coming in now. There was one from Deb Olander that said, I'm wondering if Ryan is familiar with the town seal and can help us understand why it needs updating.
Yeah, and I've been engaged by the committee, the town committee that's involved in looking into the seal. I think that the history of the seal is very interesting. It was originally, and I actually had an image of one of the enameled pins that was made for an anniversary of the founding of the town, and that ultimately that design sort of morphed into the to the seal, and it's depicting Kuchamakin, and he's actually holding his sack of 6 pounds and has his coat. I think it's one of my recommendations to the town seal committee was that if they were interested in a new seal, it would be interesting and exciting to engage a contemporary native artist to come up with a new design. I mean, it's I think that some of the issues are sort of stereotypical depictions. We see it on the state seal as well. It's frequently on a lot of town seals. It shows up on the mascot, the school mascots quite a bit, and so it's I think it is interesting though that it commemorates that story, which does have a lot of interesting details in it, as I discussed.
I see another question here. Thanks, Ryan, for that response. This one is from Rowena Hodges, and it says, at the time of the sale of Andover to Mr. Woodbridge, were there any small villages of indigenous peoples still in Andover?
Well, I think that the implication is that Roger has a village. He's got his planting area and his company, which is presumably his family and the people that he's the leader of. And so it is sort of interesting to think about just walking around, and I think you can sort of do this as you hike Avis trails or visit other places in Andover, is think about where those 4 acres are. And also whenever you're by any of the streams, think about people taking eels and how significant that was. And so I think it's not really described as a town or village, but I think that's kind of the implication of that, is that there is a town, and it's Roger and his group that is sort of the indigenous community there. One of the things too I'll add is that I think now we sort of tend to think of Andover as a pretty bustling, significant place, but in colonial days it was really on the frontier, and so there's not a lot about it. So anytime it gets mentioned, the mentions are pretty few and far between. So it's definitely kind of on the frontier, on the margins of the places where the real sort of center of power and commerce are, certainly in the 17th century. And so it is tough to find mentions. There probably should be maps and things like that, and there are some allusions to the fact that there were maps made by English cartographers but we don't really have them. And so the lack of those things, is, unfortunate. And also think about the loss of population that happens even before the English set foot, over perhaps as many as 90% of the people. So communities that probably existed are gone. Let's see. Did we see another question from somebody?
There was. On the edge
Yeah,
of-
John asks about sort of the territories, and I think that's a really interesting question. And this is something that I think is really difficult for us. I still find it challenging, and I think it's a carryover from something that the English found challenging. So when the English came here, they were used to demarcated territories. This was a town, or this was the area controlled by a particular, elite person, whoever that might have been, noble of some kind. And when the English came here, and you can sort of see this reflected in the names, right? They're all English names that Andover, that sort of come directly from England. So there's an attempt to transpose English geography, not just sort of the names, but also sort of the political geography onto the landscape. And I think that the difficulty is that it's a very different landscape. And so when I talked about in the video, the fact that you've got people who move around and have these really extensive networks of connections. So you have people who live in the Andover or Lowell areas who have connections to people in Connecticut, and that this is normal. And people that are in Dorchester, which we think of pretty far from Andover, have connections, and that this is actually there are these great maps of that were made in the southeastern United States. I think they were either made by the Chickasaw, or they were made sort of based on Chickasaw information from Chickasaw, but they're supposed to be maps, geographic maps, but they're circles with just a bunch of lines coming out of them that go to other circles that have a bunch of lines. And what they're showing are those kinds of really long distance relationships that people have. And so people here, indigenous people, had a very different conception of geography. And so the English didn't like that. They wanted to know who owns this, because we want to buy it from them. And so they wanted these neat boundaries and territories. And that's what we've attempted to kind of continue to do. We want to be able to sort of draw a line on the map, or circle, jelly bean, whatever you might call it, and say, this is where this particular tribe lived. And I think that that's the first mistake. We can't do that. We can't draw those kinds of lines, because that's not how those people really thought of the world. That wasn't the world that they lived in. And that was really a big part of the conflict between the English and indigenous people here, is that they had these very different conceptions of just basic stuff, like what's the geography look like.
We do have a couple more questions that just came in, and thank you for taking me off mute. I think you kind of addressed some of this, but one question was, were there any direct hostilities in Andover between indigenous people and settlers? Did Native people from this area relocate seasonally? So those were two of the other questions that came in. I think you kind of addressed one.
Yeah, there were, I don't know if there are any hostilities, particularly in Andover, but there are some nearby in Haverhill, and certainly during what's called King Philip's War, or Metacom's war. So King Philip was Wampanoag and lived down in really what's part of Rhode Island now, but was later in the 17th century, an attempt to rebel against the English. And the people around Andover, the Pennacook and Pawtucket, were tried to remain neutral. So they were sort of the Switzerland of the conflict. But of course, if you were indigenous, that was you were sort of suspect. And so there was a lot of there was violence against Pennacook and Pawtucket people. And what's interesting, we know, is that often what would happen is that when there were conflicts like that, they would go to what is New Hampshire today, and they're the people that they were really probably most closely related to or had connections with at the time were Abenaki people. And in one of the contemporary Abenaki groups, I think even it has Pennacook as part of their name. So kind of reflecting that that relationship. So they would go up to the Lake Winnipesaukee area, and there was even a community in New Hampshire called Pennacook. So that was sort of the direction that they went at that time, at least. And those relationships would all change periodically. In terms of seasonality, people probably were moving, but these were people who were practicing horticulture. They were growing crops, and so they had, I think, probably pretty permanent villages. There is sort of this question about locating sort of those big sort of village sites, which archaeologically hasn't really happened in our area so much. So, and there's some interesting research that people have been doing on that. So, let's see. Somebody asked about names of places, street names and things.
Yeah, that's right. They asked, do you have thoughts about naming of streets and properties? I live near Pilgrim and Mayflower Drives and Reservation Road, and wondering about centering the colonizers, and whether there's a movement to rename places to acknowledge the indigenous roots. Does the naming of Indian Ridge honor this history?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually somebody else asked me just this past week or last week, I guess, about Indian Ridge. And I don't I did a little poking around, and I don't entirely know the origins of the name, though I suspect that it comes from people discovering Native American objects there, arrowheads and stone tools and things like that. But I would say, I think it can be tricky, and I think in terms of thinking through names, names are really powerful. I mean, they're sort of subtle. They're often, they're just kind of in the periphery of our sort of cognitive vision, but they do sort of tell a lot about, places and what's important and what's not important. I remember somebody talking about changing the name of Rogers Brook. And they thought, well, that this was, it should have more of an indigenous name. And I said, well, wait, but, that's named after an indigenous person. So if you change it, you're literally removing them from the equation. I think that, some of those groups that I mentioned in the talk, it would be good to engage them in conversations about street names and place names. Certainly, there's a national effort to look at, place names that are derogatory, which, I don't know that we particularly have anything that's like that. But it is, it is interesting to think about where some of the names come from and what the histories are. So that's just learning the history is a good place to start. And then I think if people do want to engage in, conversations about should they be changed, it's good to get indigenous perspectives on that.
Be one last question. I see one here. It's from Steve Golden. Who was Woodbridge, and how did he get to negotiate such a great deal?
Well, he wasn't the only one. And if I'm remembering the story correctly about who he was, I think I believe he was a religious, leader of some kind, but I would have to go back and sort of confirm that. I could be wrong. He wasn't the only one who negotiated those kinds of deals. You can actually go online. There's a couple places where you can look at the what are called Indian deeds. So Andover doesn't have any of those deeds because there was this more sort of informal sale. But if you look, for example, at Haverhill, there is actually a deed for another tremendous, expanse that was signed over to the English for another very small sum of money by two local indigenous leaders. What's interesting about that is they had to go to Passaconaway, either Passaconaway or Wanalancet, who was sort of the Uber leader of the area, who had developed a lot of these alliances, and sort of get his blessing for that sale to happen. But there were just vast tracts that were sold by I believe Pachamakan sold large tracts more in the Boston area as well, where he was centered, as did a number of the other leaders too. So it wasn't just that particular. It wasn't just Woodbridge who struck sort of a seemingly amazing bargain. It was pretty common.
Okay, I guess it's time for me to jump back in here, and we could probably go on for quite a while talking with Dr. Wheeler, but thank you very much, Ryan, for coming tonight, for taping that presentation in advance. We really appreciate it, and thank you, Jude, for managing the questions. It seems like my whole evening has been thank you for all the different people, but certainly I do want to wrap up now. Thank everybody who came, of course, and everybody down at Oak and Iron, and thanks to Oak and Iron again for hosting. A couple of people that I haven't mentioned yet. David Jocelyn is the Andover TV person who's been managing us back and forth and is going to tie this all together and present a coherent video tape of this evening's meeting. And so you'll be able to find that on the website later on. I also want to quickly thank Mutu Arumagan, who's our webmaster, Suzanne Korshin, who's been helping with a lot of our signage designs, and Willow Chile, who has been helping with the Weed Warriors and some of our invasive plant issues. She's also helping with, as you know, maybe have heard, or if you've been to the Goldsmith Woodlands lately, you might have seen that there's a bit of work going on there as you enter on the left side, and that's part of the Weed Warriors effort as well, to kind of try to restore the wetlands there. So there's always something going on, and I really can't thank everybody, can't name everybody. If I left you out, I'm sorry, because I left out a lot of people. But thank you again to everybody who attended tonight. Thank you to those who've been donors and members. And we very much appreciate your support. So I hope it's been a nice and informative evening. And maybe next year we can really have a party together. So looking forward to that. Thank you very much, and have a good spring, good summer, so forth. Thank you all.